Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to learn about doing simple math operations and arithmetic in C#. So in order to get started, I'm going to create two integers. Let's just do a and b again, and I'll initialize them to 3 and 7. So first, let's add these two numbers together. I'm going to write console.writeLine. And to add, it's very simple. We just use the plus sign. So a plus b. Now we already saw the plus sign in the previous videos where we were doing concatenation. When you add two strings together, you're doing concatenation. When you add two numbers together, you're doing arithmetic. So this same symbol is actually used for more than one thing. So now if I run the application, I'll see the result of a plus b. And there you go. So now, instead of just adding these numbers together inside of this console.writeLine command, let's create a new variable called sum, and we'll set it equal to the value of a plus b. Now we can replace this equation with the variable sum, which represents a plus b. And we get the same result. Of course, we can also subtract, so let's do int diff equals a minus b, so we'll get the difference. We can multiply, and we use for this the star or asterisk key. And we can divide. Divided by b. And we use a / for divided. So let's create a couple more console.writeLine commands. And here we'll put in diff. Here we'll put in mul for multiply. And div. And we can see the results here. So 3 plus 7. 3 minus 7, we get a negative number. 3 times 7. And 3 divided by 7, we get 0. Now that brings us to an interesting point. So whenever we divide an integer by another integer, the return is an integer. We do not get a fraction or a decimal. What essentially happens is it cuts the decimal off and everything to the right and only returns the first digit. So 3 divided by 7 gives you an integer of 0 because it, again, cuts everything off after the decimal place. Let's say we change this to 12. So now we're going to do 12 divided by 7. Here, we only get the result 1 because 7 goes into 12 one time with a remainder. So how do we get that remainder? We use what's called the modulo key. So we'll say remainder equals a modulo b. And the modulo is just a % sign. So now if we print out console.writeLine remainder, we should see 1 for the division and 5 for the remainder. So there we go. So when we do integers, we can get the remainder using modulo. Of course, you could do all these operations with other number types too, like decimal numbers. And we can change this to double. And I'm going to just change everything to a double here. And if we make this something like 12.5 and maybe something like 7.15. So if we run the program, now we see that it's adding, subtracting, multiplying these numbers. And here you can see we have a pretty long number after the decimal when we did our division. And of course we can limit how many numbers we get after the decimal place as we want. But we'll talk about that later. Other types of decimal numbers that you could use would be a float or a decimal. So a float is usually used when you need a very imprecise decimal number, where you're not too concerned about the level of precision and how many numbers after the decimal place are actually calculated. A decimal is used for monetary transactions, stock market, things like that, where you need to be as precise as possible because those fractions of a percent over thousands of transactions can add up, and you don't want that. So another thing that's pretty important is when you're using a float or a decimal, you need to add a flag at the end of the number to let it know that you're using a float or a decimal. By default, any number that has a decimal place and doesn't have a flag, the compiler automatically assumes is a double. So you can see that when I hover over these numbers think it's a double. And of course, without the decimal place, it thinks that it's a float. Now, this works because it's a whole number and it will automatically convert it to a float of 12.0. But as soon as there's a decimal place, I'm going to get an error. So in order for it to be a float, you're going to put F for float, which is nice and easy to remember, and you see that error goes away. And for decimal, you would think it would be a D, but it's actually an M. So you're going to put M, and you see that error goes away. So pretty much anytime you write a float number or a decimal number, you got to use F and M. A little annoying, but hopefully you can remember it. One more thing you should know here is you could do these math operations on different types. So if I have an int and a double, you can see that all of these operations are still valid. What's happening is the compiler will do an implicit type conversion, and it will actually convert this int into a double and change it to 3.0. This happens here when we do the actual calculation. You can see all of these examples work. Now, one little exception is with a decimal. So with a decimal, it will not let you do any math operations with a different type. You would have to explicitly convert the type, but we'll talk about that in the future. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is increment and decrement. So let's say we have int a and we set it equal to 5. Oftentimes, we simply need to increment or decrement a number by 1. We could write a equals a plus 1, and this line will actually change the value of a to a plus 1, or 6. And if we write a to the console, we should see 6. So the value of a has now been changed to the value of a plus 1. But there's a shorthand method for this. We can write a plus plus. What this is the same thing as writing a equals a plus 1. So now if we write to the console, we should see 6 again. One thing to note when you're using increment, if you were to put this directly inside the console.write line and run the application, it's still going to show 5. Now the reason this is happening is because it is actually calculating the increment after the expression has been run. So the expression being write this value to the console, which currently is 5, and then after it does that, it's going to then increment it to 6. So again, if I write console.writeLine and just put a now and run it, I'll see 5 and then 6, because at the end of this console.writeLine, it's then going to increment a by 1 and gives you 6. Same thing with minus minus to do decrement. See? On the next line, it prints 4 after this happens. One way we can get around that is we can put plus plus or minus minus before our variable. And what that'll do is this will tell the compiler, run this first and then run the full line. So this will increment A to 6 and then print the line, and then it's going to just print A again, which is still going to be 6. And it prints 6 twice. More often, you'll really just see something like this, where on this line, you would just write A++ before you do the console.writeLine, and this will increment here and then print it here. So that's about it for this video. We'll be back with the next one soon. I hope you guys are enjoying, and I'll see you next time. Bye.